This is Runehammer. The Rangers of Nemedia. The Tunnel of Ordur by Brandish Gilhelm. After their disastrous return to the ruin that was once Westburg, the Rangers of Nemedia faced one of their deadliest days. A trek through the tunnel beneath that crumbling place to the very seat of the darkness in the Greenway, the Sword of Wolves, Ordur, the tower once home to Queen Ledea. Now laid to rubble by the flood that destroyed the entire town, that tower was little more than a ring of stones, and there the mighty master of Garrett Frack tangled the timelines and fed on death. But first things first. Struggling to reach their former home, the Rangers found themselves face to face with a Zymer from a darker dimension. Savage orcs under Frack's influence massed in armored legions, and all hope seemed lost. But not complete was the evil in that other Zymer's heart. And he had one hope left for his allies of parallel reality. It was little more than a hatched pit leading down through scree and drainage. "Go! The fiend is reaching full power!" That other Zymer barked, opening the rotted hatch as the eyeless orcs were closing in. This was none other than the Tunnel of Ordur. In fable, it was a single 10-mile-long shaft, hewn in ancient times to break siege or invasion on the town. Directly below the central tower did it reach, through rocky depths, but most believed it only myth. No myth, for here the entrance was, inhaling the air with cold deep, and in they went, stills first, leaping in, tumbling down, then Foxy and Zymer with some effort, and finally Helm, sliding with the grate of steel and spear like a pick-cracking stone. Through Helm's eye slots he took one last look up, his gut twisted with odd dread. The other Zymer, darker of eyes than the one we know, but not entirely lost to whatever bizarre cosmic rift had created him, shut the hatch. "Wardar found that an Ordus Transmor Bidarak!" And by spell muttered, he sealed it, transformed it into solid rock. A din of swords and screams was heard then above, muffled through the granite, and he no doubt gave his life for their escape. In clatter and clump the Rangers hit bottom. Stills was crushed like a bug. Zymer all but broke one arm, and one of Helm's spears went to splinters on impact. One by one, offering hand and help, they found their feet. It was pitch black. A hush hung in the low-ceilinged gloom. Zymer dared a whisper, reaching out with trembling fingers for the nearby wall. It was rough, crumbling, root-pierced, and running with cold, earthy rivulets of mud. "I never thought it was even real." His voice was weakened, his courage hung by a thread. With a scrape, crackle, and whoosh, Stills lit up a torch in one motion. It flared to life, blinding at first, and now they saw their task. A root-tangled, rubble-strewn tunnel 4 feet wide or less, ceiling that low in places, stretching into the black ahead. Flickering light catching the endless concentric ridges of walls, hewn with hasty picks in military days long ago. At their left, a heap of ruined barrels and crates held rotted spear hafts, a scatter of rusted arrowheads, and a few crushed helmets. Their type was the fluted barbute of Ledea's troop, but centuries old in design, with no chin loop or hammered nose plate. "Gods," Helm rumbled, sheathing his weapon and hanging his helm behind him. "This is a desperate choice." "Hardly a choice," Zymer huffed. "We tread now to the very heart of our enemy. I sense great evil below the White Tower, or what's left of it." "I've no fear of evil," Helm nudged Stills to advance. "Only that we fail our folk. We go, and mind the shadows." Ahead took they 10 paces, picking their way, following Still's gleam. But something was missing. Foxy. All three of them stopped and looked back to their grim landing place. There stood the little fox, matted wet fur in muddy lumps, all shivering with cold, and the rangers of Nemedia stood in shock, for Foxy was afraid. She shuddered and hunched and seemed to be stepping slowly backward. Her eyes trembled with watery terror. Helm moved to console her, but she flinched. Zymer seemed flummoxed, shrugging with pity and kneeling down. Then Stills handed his flame to Helm and strode forward with no hesitation. Down stooped that dark-faced goblin, once a fiend, a wanton thief, a hater of men. But now he was a ranger, a hero, a friend to all. He sat next to the pitiful wet fox and held his stubby arms out. To him she came, tentative, and he hugged her like a bear. With his cloak he dried her orange fur and made fluffy that great tail of hers. Her ears he petted with tender friendship and whispered something there in that odd gobbish speech of his. And then stood those two, fox and goblin, side by side, and both were bright with bravery. Know you, O reader, the very best of us, for here they were at hell's mouth and ready to meet it head on, together. Even the bard learners of Norberg know that the rangers faced three great trials in that lightless tube, the Minotaur, the Rails, and the Great Evil. But to call such a flippant summary injustice is being gentle. The poor storyteller recounts their quest as if shopping for peppers in the streets of Iridrum, but make no mistake, this was a deadly, miserable struggle even to gain a few feet. When that horned wretch showed his savage face, or the swarms of red spiders crowded the corridor with poison hate, death was so close it fouled the very air. Never so close to ruin were our heroes as this day, so brace your wits, and let me tell you what rage seethes below our feet, and the price to face it. It all began with 5 miles of broken passage. 5 arduous miles in oubliette damp, crouching, crawling, squeezing, dragging. Roots grabbed and choked, freezing springs dribbled from above. Like earthworms, our heroes wriggled and grunted, pulled at wrist and ankle alike in a chain of misery. Lo! Imagine that cold and crushing depth. Made they at last their feet, for after the journey, the tunnel opened to its former glory. No longer crumbling here, it was flat-floored, 15 feet at the ceiling brace posts and 20 feet between the walls. The rangers stood upright at last, stretching their weary limbs, straightening their sore backs, and the torchlight was feeble in the larger space. Only Helm's clinking armor betrayed them, for all 4 held their breath with stealth and fear. The tunnel of Hath Ordur, Zymer commented, breaking the silence that had hung for an age. The walls seemed to tremble even with his squeaking whisper. Stills forged ahead, bearing torch and Foxy at his side. There he found a large heap of wooden crates, iron-ringed barrels, and old oak weapon racks all in a row. Piled high with halberds and longbows were these stocks, rotted armor, great coils of galleon rope, rock bars, mattocks, and banded shields in tiny rows. A larder fit for an army. The rangers picked through the junk, unimpressed with most of it, harvesting only a few tools and weapons, and then they remembered where they were and sensed a change in the air. Helm held one gloved hand upright, and they all froze. Foxy spiraled ahead 5 strides, sniffing the air with twitching urgency. "Listen," Helm risked, donning his helm with slow, silent motion. Stills planted the torch in a wall bracket, drew twin daggers, and squinted into the dark. His gobbish eyes were adjusting to the deeps, and he could see 100 yards into the shadows. And there he saw something, or was it someone, moving against the glimmer of water trickling on a distant wall. Before any further communication could be made, it was upon them. Gods, how that thing came rushing out of the darkness. At a full leaning run it charged, great yellow horns first, brass nose ring gleaming in torch glow, and in its cruel furry hands a great battle axe 10 feet long at least. It sprinted forward on hoofed fury, howling at the final second with beady red eyes in dim beast sockets. no fools are the Rangers, and all in unison they parted, 2 to each side, clinging to the walls, and through their rank the Minotaurs stumbled, slamming into the rubble where the tunnel narrowed like a battle ram. Helm took his place at the fore, meeting the huge bulky beast as it spun about. Longsword raised the warrior as a shield, and a javelin he thrust forward. That thrust was frustrated, furious, and went right to the bull's heart. But there, on that heaving chest, the weapon snapped like a twig. Helm stumbled with the force of it. At the same instant, Stills sprung onto the half-bull like a mosquito, delivering 3 lightning-fast jabs with his blades, but the wounds were only scratches, and he tumbled off those huge shoulders in a mess. Yeah! Then took the Minotaur, some cursed denizen of this unholy cavern, one huge inhale and loosed a puff of rage. One hoof twisted it into the stone, and another charge was about to spring, but Zymer now had the upper hand, lifting his great book high. "Hermeta!" he cried, and a single slender bolt of white radiance spun from his open hand like lightning. It struck the bullman square, piercing right through and shattering the rocks behind. The creature bowed its head a moment, still poised on bent legs, and in that huge, deep throat a laugh grumbled. Then it exploded, unharmed, down the tunnel again, ripping through Helm's waist plates with that massive, ragged battle axe. "It is guarded by some ward," Zymer called, falling away from the brutal charge. The thing sprinted 15 yards before spinning for another approach. It seemed blind with fury, enraged by decades in this blackness, or bound here by some dire guise of dark magic. Helm was struggling back into defense, bleeding terribly. The goblin called Stills hurled both dirks at the creature with a whip. Both landed their mark, but bounced away with futile clatter. But then he saw it. With goblin eyes drawn to gold glint, he saw it. The Minotaur was clad in rags and fur only, save a gleaming brass and iron girdle, hinged at both sides and etched with spirals and runic glyphs. A magic belt. "Belt! Belt!" Stills yelled, jumping up and down. Helm took his meaning, went to one knee and raised his spear like a wall sentry. And then in came the next charge. The thing was huge, clumsy, and careless. Helm's spear met its mark, hitting the iron belt, but the spearhead, a cold-forged barb of gray, bent like warm butter. Through Helm's defense, the beast rushed and smashed the warrior against the far rubble like a rag doll. Helm spat blood, and the battle turned for the worse. Now the bull had the upper hand, casting Helm aside like a child. A shrill bark caught its glowing red eyes. It was Foxy, now far ahead in the gloom, calling for a retreat. This foe seemed invincible, and so her cue they took, and began to flee forward. Zymer grabbing that feeble torch and staying to the walls. "Run!" he yelled. But when Helm went to his boots, he buckled with blood in his beard and cracked ribs, pulling him back down. To his friend, Stills rolled like a gymnast, then helped Helm up. It was a ridiculous, fearful scene to see a 3-foot goblin helping an armored Northman to his feet, but they began to flee. The Minotaur, a creature made by magic to run, was already in a leaning sprint. Right past them it blasted, ripping with that silver axe, spraying Helm's blood again. Right past them, then through Zymer, who fell to his knees as it went past. Foxy bounced from wall to wall, enraging the thing, and rather than turning, it kept it a full run. Foxy only a few feet ahead of it, for she had its attention. Louder and louder were its howls. It struck the walls with its battle axe, driven mad with fury at the little fox darting and mocking. Then Zymer felt tiny hope. For ahead the tunnel narrowed again, encroached by a slide of boulders. The gap was big enough for them, but far too narrow for the horned Hellion. He waved, ran, but Stills and Helm were falling behind. At last Foxy reached the narrow. With a cracking slam, the bullman hit the crack with its huge spiral horns. Then a breath it took turned, and Zymer slid between its huge legs with a silly flailing momentum. It cared not. The beast's eyes were on Helm again. It smelled blood. The axe it spun, hafted with cracking furry knuckles, and set to charge again.
Come on, damn you!
Stills cackled at Helm, who stumbled and bled all in a slippery red mess. He was barely conscious. Stills saw the Minotaur, the result of some lost age of horrors, coming at them stride by stride, and in slow motion it huffed and bounded, each hoof clap louder and louder. Then Stills knew what had to be done, and he let crumple the Northman. The goblin drew out a single arrow, broke the head from it, and took 2 odd-looking strides, wide-legged, side to side, baffling the Minotaur with meaningless fakery and waving arms, and then compressed and leapt that tiny, long-eared madman. He sprung up onto the thing's ringed nose, vaulted, and then back around like a satchel slung for a journey. It was a mind-defying feat of luck, and he was in his position. That broken arrow he jabbed downward, with keen gobbish eyes fixed on the iron hinges that held the magic girdle in place. He meant to pop the square-headed linchpin like a blacksmith. Helm saw this mad plan unfolding as the beast approached, and with what little strength he had, he held his screaming gut with one arm and drew forth his long sword with the other. On both feet he managed a fighting stance, and the Minotaur was pleased to kill him right there. Somehow, by the luck of small folk or destiny granted by gods unseen, the broken arrow found its tiny mark. The hinge pin slid straight down, popped, and landed with a clink. The iron belt slumped, went crooked, and then fell away from the monster's waist. Not a split second before it reached Helm, axe descending in an arc of death. Thor himself will tell of it, for that massive weapon met its target, hacking through Helm's breastplate and into one shoulder terribly. Stills tumbled away, and the rangers all held their breath. But below the hairy bulk, a coughing chuckle came. The thing convulsed, then slid away in a limp heap. Helm's longsword was skewered clean through the thing, propelled by its own terrible weight to deadly effect. Helm's eyes went dark, and he slumped against the rough wall in a pool of blood. Dear reader, you may want to take a breath here. For though a ranger of Nemedia met their end in this terrible tunnel, it was not Helm. It was not his time. Zymer knew little of healing magic, but enough to keep the fighting man awake and on his feet and moving. Blood was everywhere, and he barely had the strength to speak. But Helm needed only one word. Onward. So they went. That ragged little company. The bull's axe they hooked at Helm's belt, his other weapons destroyed. Stills stomped one horn right off the fur-clad head with a snap, promising to drink from it one day. And on they went. Leaning on Zymer, stumbling here and there, Helm held to life like a lion. They picked their way through the cave-in ahead and covered a span of miles as they had before, wretched, cold, clumsy, in the mind-melting straight line of the tunnel dim. I must rest. At least a moment, Helm conceded at last. Here, mind the stone there, Zymer comforted, lowering the fighter to the ground with care. Foxy came and sat beside the armored giant, and Stills fumed across the tunnel, hungry for some kind of vengeance. Clear that red from your eyes, my little friend, Helm said. Our wrath will be living to tell this tale. He laughed a bit, but it looked terribly painful. Stills said nothing and methodically took inventory of weapons and gear. You've at least 3 broken ribs, Spearman, and 2 cuts too deep for any medicine I possess. A comforting report, old man. Foxy then stood alert and darted off. What is she? Thor's beard, not another damned minotaur. But seconds later she returned, mouth bulging with a tuft of odd luminous yellow moss. Zymer reached forward, smiling. Ah, a bundle of loom. This makes a fine poultice. Here we are. With effort, Zymer tended Helm's shoulder, working carefully around ragged, split metal. But it was impossible.
"The breastplate is ruined, old friend. Be rid of it."
They did, casting the iron shell aside in a bloody pile, and then Zymer tended that terrible cut, loom-packed and soothing. "Better," Helm admitted at last, eyeing his cuirass like a heartbroken child.
Poof!
Stills joked.
Who needs armor anyway?
They three laughed quietly there in the dim, and spirits lifted. Onward, always onward. In some versions of the tale, the Rangers fought that cursed Minotaur all the way to the railway. In others, it fell into a great bottomless fissure, trying to crush Foxy with its great double-bladed axe. All the stories share one truth, that Helm was barely alive when they found the abandoned rail cars, and faced the swarm. Remember, O reader, that this tunnel was used long ago to move soldiers from the White Tower out beyond the city outskirts to break a siege force. To this end, the longest stretch of the tunnel was equipped with a two-railed car system. A curved redoubt and cable returned the carts to their origin, below Ordur for more passengers, and so it was 100 men could move 10 miles in less than an hour. Onto this derelict mechanical scene the Rangers came, and Zymer made sense of the levers and pulleys.
"This should hasten our efforts," the old wizard explained,
pulling a rusted lever. Cables came to life, tensioning, then tugging slowly with corroded squeaks and the chain of cars that went on beyond sight. And through them into the return shaft they could ride. No terrible clatter was heard, no falling ruin, and so perhaps the old rails were intact. But they had little choice. Helm had only hours of life left in him, even with his incredible will to survive. So they piled into 2 cars, looking foolish in the grim scene, and began jostling up the rusted tracks like human cargo. "Let's hope that was the last welcome we get down here," Helm muttered.
"The true evil lies at the tunnel's end, I'm afraid, my spearman. I fear we are set to learn much before the ordeal is over."
Many have asked why the Rangers did not take a night's reprieve, even in that gloomy dim, to gather their strength. So easy is it for us who enjoy their heroism to question their haste. No more than a moment had passed before the next harrow was upon them. This was the swarm of red spiders that inhabited those old rail cars, picking at long-abandoned supply crates and larder barrels. The spiders varied in size from a man's hand to an arm's span across. Terrible, spiny, many-eyed things that had never seen the sun. In the silence of that dull place, they had been left to their own doings and multiplied into a tumbling, crowded multitude. They infested every inch of the rail tunnel and crashed onto the Rangers like red water on rocks. Forgive an old bard for turning away here, but the horror of it is too much to withstand. I'll never sleep again if I retell every detail of that hideous battle. Red-whiskered legs and spindly, tangled, grasping, twitching things touching in the dark. Some say the pitiful torch was even snuffed out at one point, leaving the Rangers to hack and stab in pitch darkness, covered in the clawing, biting arachnids, screaming and chugging along in those rust-covered carts. It's too much even to consider, much less endure in detail. But we must look closer into the story as that terrible chapter ended, as the countless thousands of them lay in heaps, tumbling away, crinkling into leg-folded balls in that repulsive way that spiders die, or slumping awfully against the Rangers in dead piles, and they were defeated. But Stills had been stung. The wound was angry and swollen in seconds, oozing with green venom that smelled of rot. Another torch he lit and tried to burn it clean, but the poison was in him already, and he could feel cold shudders going down his back. One hand, nearest the sting, was already swollen and starting to take on a thick, whiskered, rigid look. Black veins, almost beginning to look spider-like. It was horrific, and there was no time to revel in it or worry. More would come. They had to move. Now. They all 4 leapt or tumbled from the rail cars at the iron-bumpered terminus. Forward they went, hearing more spiders behind, and finally, Udin's mercy, finally they found a door. Beyond they went and slammed it fast, breathing, terrified, exhausted, smelling of insect death.
Never again,
Helm spat.
Stand firm, my company,
Zymer began, his tone changing from terror to resolve.
Stand and meet the doom of our time, of all time. Stand and lay eyes on the evil that dwells beneath Hath Ordur.
They looked, and the tunnel ended in a huge cavernous opening. It was a cavity 200 feet in span and bottomless with fissured drop-offs. Only a dim set of surface cracks let light in from far above, and a laddered tunnel exit was visible on the far side. The space troubled them not, though, for writhing, rising, rippling up from the void was a terror from beyond the primordius, beyond nightmare, beyond possibility. An earth-eater, a great worm, the brass-skinned titans of the young earth, hornworms, some call them, or stone-chewers. They ate the world hollow, as some know, and uncoiled to 300 feet from tail to teeth. Massive rasping plates and rope-like thews, all wrapped in an eel-like gargantuan from the depths. And it was right in front of them. But this was not the only sight bending them with terror and hating their minds for trying to comprehend. At the center of the chamber, hovering in thin air, was a sort of storm of energy. It spun and convulsed, ripped and folded in on itself. Within were views of mountains, then skies, fires, and hells. It crackled with lightning and blue flames, and then showed screaming faces or towering parapets of some long-dead kingdom. Around this phenomenon the worm wrapped and seemed to feed on the rift in some mockery of all that should be. But Zymer was unfazed.
I aided your creation, demon, and I will unmake you!
At this, Zymer took his arcane tone, dropped his old book, and began to weave some terrible spell 'tween hands that were more like bony claws. The hum built, the colossus spotted them. The battle, if it could even be called that, was joined. Helm abandoned weakness, by some miracle of heroes blood generations old, and then he stood tall as a tree next to the wizard. The Minotaur's axe he rose like a beacon of silver, and dared the thing to see him. It was madness. Stills, keeping his wits, had one hand on Foxy's back, tensed on all toes. He surveyed the chamber for detail, spotting a series of crumbling pedestals and stalagmites twixt the larger rock surfaces. A clever set of leaps could traverse the space if the Earth-Eater didn't devour the very pillars of reality before they took the chance. He pointed with his tiny little fingerless gloves to the crumbling path, but Helm and Zymer had their hate fixed on the Leviathan. And so Stills sprung. Across went he, flying perilously close, an arm's length only from the sliding plated belly of the massive eel. White-tipped horns and spines came within inches of his tunic as he leapt, but he made it across. Foxy was behind him now, paralyzed with fear. Around it twisted, opening that mouth, revealing mouths within mouths, rows of jagged tooth saws, all twitching and hungry for rock and blood alike. Up it arced and then came crashing down. Zymer and Helm both sidestepped like bullfighters, a pun not lost on this storyteller considering their ordeal, and the worm smashed through their precipice, taking rubble and ruin down into the black with it. But they could hear it down below, twisting for a return. "Come on, old man," Helm yelled. But Zymer was beyond the mortal world. His eyes were blank white balls, his feet barely touched the ground. This spell was no petty missile or fire burst. He meant to annihilate everything in one terrible blast. The spearman took foot, bounding across where Stills had shown the way, and made his feet at the far side, waving to Foxy, who still would not budge. Again the behemoth rose, howling like a thunderstorm, feeding up on that rip of magical energy, tearing time and space to ribbons in its endless fangs. Up it towered, then Zymer released his spell. Around the old man, a ring of red fire formed, expanded, doubled, and spun, changed colors, separated, it whirled and vibrated as he bellowed magical words in a fury. Inward he crushed his hands, then flung them wide as an eagle, and the energy was flown across, bright as hellfire. The rings of power seared the verm's plated flesh, ripped it, split the horns to splinters, and shook boulders from the already fractured ceiling. Udin's mercy, the sound that thing made when so smote. It was terribly wounded, and the rift of energy sputtered, losing its power. Death was coming for the unholy thing at last, and its grand spell was dissipating, but it still had a convulsion of fury left.
Now into the depths, fiend! Your time has ended!
Zymer regained his feet, smoldering. His robes were singed, sending up smoke, and he stumbled toward the perilous set of jumps, his old knees barely getting him across. They were within sight of the ladder-clad exit as they assumed it to be, and Helm hacked a great chunk of purple flesh from the Leviathan as it passed, barely avoiding another crushing bite of that wagon-sized mouth. And they ran, all in the chaos, the madness, and Stills suddenly remembered Foxy, and halted. He looked. There she was, trembling, beyond her depth. She was almost lost in the darkness now, so far from the torchlight, and her hind legs quivered with fright.
Come on, stupid!
Stills screamed in the madness of it all.
Come on!
This shook the fox's wits loose, and her eyes cleared. The orange ears laid back in terror, but her legs worked again, and her head darted, looking for a way. But just then the giant came across again, devouring the pedestals of stone they had traversed in one horrific seismic chomp. The way was gone, the cavern too far across, the fall endless. A tear welled in Still's eye, but still he waved to her. The two men were already at the exit, vanishing. Here that wonderful goblin found his courage. Here he met the tradition of the Thumush with high chin and bright heart. Here he found his stand and made it. There was one chance only. He had to rely on Foxy to see it.
Down here, you ugly sod!
He screamed at the Titan. It bent and spun and prepared to descend on the sound. Its eyeless fury was set on Stills and Stills alone. Around and across, down and toward him it came, mouth agape like a window into hell, and Stills stood his ground, releasing a final cry.
Yeah!
This it honed in on, coiling across the cavern. Foxy finally comprehended. In one great set of bounding leaps, that little varmint went up, flying onto the heaving shelled back of the worm. She ran along it like a twisting impossible bridge as it flew towards Stills. Across she bounded like a gymnast, eyes popping out of her furry head in horror, and at last flying out of control to the far side. But then the bite landed and made its mark. The stone platform was hewn in two, crushed to gravel, and amidst all of it, Stills, the hero of Westburg Manor, was gone. Not easy is it to tell this tale. With no shortage of tears, I remember when I was told. How much had that hero discovered what so many of us crave to know? That in the moment we pass the test and stand firm. That we die for love and meet our end burning bright as the sun even in the blackest hour before dawn. And so it was. And the telling of it cannot make it undone. Alone, the Rangers, just 3 of them now, made the surface. The evil was fading, the sun rising, and that odd gloom hanging over Hath Ordur, the sword of wolves, was clearing. The good of old was near, but their sadness made it hollow. On knees they let tears flow for their friend, Helm at last standing. To the east he faced, and Udin's brow was bent with sorrow. We stay true to one another. We honor this day on our damn feet. In the sun's early rays, a multitude of folk began to appear. The orcs had vanished, fled, or simply turned to dust. These were goodly folk, the citizens of the Greenway, and they began to return. They began to reclaim their town at last. The evil that lay beneath had faded. Now before the next chapter unfolds, clear your eyes. Stand straight and lift your spirits. For where that evil tower once stood with hated elven tyranny, now a humble grave is found. It's a simple white barrow stone, narrow and clean cut with a spiral etching. At Udin's prayer it bids us remember that no one is too small, no friend too humble to change this world, to make a better tomorrow. This memorial is all we have left, and we are better for it.